In this video, I want to talk about the alternative All-Stars, and I was set a really interesting challenge recently by a user called Trophy Gatherer on my very first video, where I was setting out my ultimate All-Star faction. Trophy Gatherer asked how I would build an All-Star faction made up of those factions from the expansions that did not make the cut in the actual All-Stars faction. I'd be swapping out geeks for sheep, but the rest of the expansions would remain the same. If you watched my tier list video about the promo factions, you'll have seen that I really do like the All-Star faction. I think they're a well-balanced faction with a clear identity and structure, despite having no unique or new cards. And I was really intrigued by this challenge, to see if I could create a balanced alternative to the All-Stars that had some kind of coherent theme using those factions that were cast aside, a revenge and redemption story you might say. These are the factions from the expansions that are in play. For core set, it's aliens, pirates, robots, tricksters, wizards, and zombies. For awesome level 9000, it's bear cavalry and steampunks. For obligatory Cthulhu, it's Innsmouth and Miskatonic University. For science fiction double feature, it's cyborg apes and super spies. For monster smash, it's giant ants and vampires. For pretty, it's princesses and kitty cats. For It's Your Fault, it's superheroes, sharks, and tornadoes. For cease and desist, it's changerbots and ignobles. For what we're thinking, it's rockstars and explorers, and then finally, of course, the sheep. I could see straight away why some of these factions didn't make the cut. This was going to be a lot harder than I thought. The same rules apply for the All-Stars. It's going to be a standard power structure with one minion and one action from each expansion, each from different factions, except for the sheep, of course. So here's how I tackled this challenge. I knew straight away that the core set, because it has the most factions, would be my final pick, as there inevitably must be enough choice there to fill my last two spaces, regardless of what happens with the rest of the picks. Similarly, I knew that It's Your Fault should come quite late on, given that there are three factions, so more choice, but also that those factions aren't really specific. There are a lot of cards in those factions that could slot into a faction such as this. So I started with Cthulhu, as I figured this would be the hardest, and when I looked at those two factions, I could immediately see why they were rejected, and how hard this challenge would actually be to create something coherent. Innsmouth only have the locals, and I absolutely cannot throw one local into the faction, so the minion has to come from Miskatonic University. I immediately discounted the Professor and Librarian, as the power 4 and 5 slots are just too important, and those minions are far too specific, relying on madness cards. Likewise, it couldn't really be the Psychologist, as although it presents minor synergies with Cthulhu pairings, it's much too specific to include in an all-star faction, so it has to be the Researcher, as the power 2 slot is probably the most inconsequential, and just one madness card has no bearing on the final score, so in a pinch this card is a power 2, draw a Mystic Studies. There are also minor synergies with Anansi Tales and factions that like discarding cards, as this could be a free discard if needed. On the action side though, we still have the Innsmouth problem. There are some very easy eliminations: Mysteries of the Deep, Recruitment, Return to the Sea, Sacred Circle, and Spreading the Word are all out. In Plain Sight and the Deep ones are just too weak to include in the faction, which only really leaves New Acolytes. While I'm not thrilled by this choice, this card is generic enough to work in a faction like this, the ability is interesting enough, and it can be useful in the right pairings and matchups. In the end, the choices turned out to be quite easy because they really just selected themselves. So we've got the Researcher and New Acolytes in the faction. One expansion down, 9 to go. I turn to Sheep next, as I have to pick two cards from this faction and I want to make those choices while I have the most slots available to me. I turn to the actions first, as I figured this would probably be easier given all of the minions are potentially viable candidates. Like Innsmouth, there were some very easy cuts. Counting Sheep is just awful, so it's out. Wood for Sheep and To Follow or Not are too random and weak to be included. That's the same for Shearing, it's just too niche and there'll be better draw options available later on. Hello Dolly is just too complex, I think, of an ability to include in an all-star faction. On the Lamb is possibly too strong to include, so that just leaves In Sheep's Clothing and You Shall Pass. Now if you've seen my all-star faction videos, you'll know that You Shall Pass actually made it into my faction, and it'll be no surprise to hear that it makes it in here as well. It's not an in-your-face broken card, it's just really solid. The move, the draw, and the extra action, it packs so much punch just for one card. In Sheep's Clothing, on the other hand, is just too situational an ability to justify a slot in the faction, and it's not a patch on You Shall Pass. With the action chosen, it's onto the minions, and as I mentioned earlier, all of these cards could in theory make the cut. I felt that Black Sheep was just too random to be included in the 4 slot. Ram was a possibility, but I was aware from the other factions I had to choose from that I couldn't easily make a coherent return to hand theme. Little Bo Peep was certainly a contender, but the King Minion is such a crucial slot, and while Bo Peep was generic enough of an ability to include, when you've got King Rex in the All-Stars, Little Bo Peep just doesn't really have the same wow factor for me. In the end, I thought it was safest just to include the Flock, as again, the Power 2 slot is the lowest impact minion slot, and there are the most minion spaces available there. So with Flock and You Shall Pass added, that's 2 expansions down, and by having to include Sheep, it really has defined the theme for me. It's going to have to be a support movement faction with some sub-themes underneath. With what were to me clearly going to be the hardest expansions, where to go next opens up just a little bit more. So looking at the factions in Cease and Desist, Pretty Pretty, and Monster Smash, I knew that those 3 would be the next trickiest to do. I start jumping around all over the place now, as I was doing the easy picks, and then coming back to factions where, in theory, multiple cards could be chosen depending on the direction that the easy picks were taking me. So let's look at Pretty Pretty next. With Kitty Cats and Princesses, I knew the minion would have to come from the Kitty Cats. I didn't want Eliza as the King Minion, and the only other real alternative would be Snow White. But looking across the piece at the other factions available, I do have other King Minions in mind. The Princess's actions I also feel are more wide open, they're much more generous, whereas the Kitty Cat actions are focused around their playstyle and they're quite niche. For Kitty Cat minions though, there really is only one choice. It can't be Queen Fluffy or Whiskers because without the package at support they just wouldn't make any sense. Mr. Grumpers is just too weak as a standalone card, so the only one that makes any kind of sense is Muffin. And whereas the issue with Muffin in high numbers is that the ability is wasted by the end of the turn, I think that with the All-Stars themselves, having just one copy of an ability like this can bypass a lot of the issues and wasted minion plays that sometimes come from this card. As the Princesses have a few viable candidates, I'm going to come back to this action slot when my choice has been narrowed down further. I turn to Cease and Desist next, another expansion that makes my choices quite easy. Looking at the ignoble minions, I knew it couldn't be one of them. The only one that makes any kind of sense would have been Sneaky Squire, but even then, to what extent does it really make sense outside of a few factions? And it certainly doesn't make sense in the context of what I have to work with. The Changerbots, however, have a few viable picks for the minion slot. Huffy certainly plays into the emerging movement theme. Solar Shout is just a solid minion, and Leader 2 again has a really solid general ability. As Huffy is actually in the Power 2 slot, I didn't want to have any minions that were in the wrong printed power group, so I didn't want 4 Power 3 minions in my faction, but one of them was actually a Power 2. That's partly me being OCD and pedantic, but it's also just mirroring what the actual All-Stars do, and Huffy would be quite a weak minion to have in at Power 3. Solar Shout is really solid, but I didn't see it fitting in with the overarching theme for where the faction was going. The actual All-Stars have lots of extra action plays, and this faction is supposed to be the alternative All-Stars, the rejects, so to speak. I don't want to also have lots of extra action plays. In my mind, when I reviewed all the factions, I had a Leader 2 down as the top pick for the King Minion slot. Not only is it above 5 power like King Rex in the actual All-Stars, but I feel like King Rex and Leader 2 are too often compared King Minions. Finally, with the emerging movement theme, the ability to give a minion plus 2 power and then move it to another base is both strong and ties in quite well with the theme of the faction. This was a clear one for me. As for the ignoble actions though, there are a few candidates. Activate the Spy, Banner Call, Hostage Exchange, Inevitable Betrayal, and Repaying Debts are all out, as I think they're just too specific. Fate of the Favourites, Out of Sight, and Red Birthday Party, though, are all considerations. This is another one I'm going to have to come back to when my faction's been fleshed out a bit more. The final troublesome expansion is Monster Smash, and yes, I am going to have to choose a vampire card. And for the vampires, it has to be a minion. Not only do I not like the giant ant minions in isolation, but they also break the printed power unwritten rule that I explained earlier. This means it must be a vampire minion. It can't be the Count, as I've already chosen my King Minion. I don't want Heavy Drinker, as it's just terrible. Night Stalker is not awful, but it's quite a weak power 4 in my opinion, which just leaves Fledgling Vampire. My hands are tied here, I don't much like it. At least it's in the Power 2 slot, which is the least consequential and has the most space. Fundamentally, it's a Power 2 which becomes a Power 3. It's not awful. For a Giant Ants action, again there are some very easy removals. Arcana Magic, Under Pressure, We Are the Champions, We Will Rock You, and Who Wants to Live Forever are all out, as there just won't be enough power counters floating around to make this a viable strategy. The Show Must Go On did inspire me to include a protection card, but this one is just too specific to be useful in the faction. I actually initially chose Gimme the Prize, as I thought it, in combination with a movement theme, adding power counters would make for good synergy. However, towards the end of creating the faction, I actually came back and made the switch to Headlong, as I felt that there just weren't quite enough move a minion style cards in the faction, and I needed another one to come back and just better balance it. Headlong does also come with 2+1 power counters for a minion, which in combination with Leader 2 and Flock could make for quite a significant power transfer from one base to another. We can add Fledgling Vampire and Headlong to the faction. So next I turned to Autumn level 9000, as I felt that this would be one of the easier expansions to choose from now that I have a primary movement theme. For the minion, Bear Cavalry made the most sense. It plays into the movement theme, this time providing antagonistic movement. It can also combo with Flock to provide a power burst to another base. On the action side, there were a few viable candidates here. Scrap Diving is a solid recovery card, but the actual All-Stars have It's Astounding, which is a better version of Scrap Diving. Zeppelin could have helped fill the gap of not having enough move one of your minion cards, but I feel it's not really necessary anymore. Difference Engine is a nice residual card draw, but I feel I can get that somewhere else. Agromotive is just solid, but for me it was Rotary Slug Thrower. What I look for in a movement faction is payoff for the movement that they have. Well, Rotary Slug Thrower is this faction's payoff. You spread out and then converge and drop a Rotary Slug Thrower for a surprise break. In the end, these two turned out to be two fairly easy picks. All the while, I had been constantly glancing at the It's Your Fault factions whilst going over some of the previous picks. With tornadoes, sharks, and superheroes to pick from, there was a wealth of choice. But now that I knew I had a movement style faction, I was able to focus my choices a bit more. I still had both 4-power minion slots available, and there are 2 excellent contenders in Great White and Cyclone. Now you may be thinking that Great White is objectively better, and it is, maybe, but my aim isn't to create the best faction possible with what I have to work with, but to create a balanced faction. Also, my faction has no destruction cards at the moment. To add 1 destruction card would feel at odds with the identity of the faction, which is an important part of faction creation. So this one is a Cyclone include for me. This does now make my Nobles action pick quite easy from earlier on. Any window for Fate of the Favourites and Red Birthday Party to make it in has now closed, which means that Out of Sight is the last one left standing. I do absolutely hate this pick. Talking about faction identity, this one really goes against the grain here. The redeeming part of this action is that it does have some minor synergy with some of the cards that have already been chosen, and some that are yet to come. So it's not completely at odds with the faction, but it's not ideal really. The remaining minion picks then have to come from What Were We Thinking, Science Fiction Double Feature, and the core set. For What Were We Thinking, there were 2 clear choices, Guide and Rickroll. Guide, interestingly enough, I felt was potentially too strong, but also potentially too niche, given that my faction doesn't have the big payoff like X Never Marks the Spot that the Explorers have. My faction has some movement, but not everything moves, which might make the Guide just too situational to fill such a big minion slot. On the other hand, with a Cyclone, Flock, You Shall Pass, and Headlong, as well as partner faction possibilities in one turn, a Guide might just be too good. In the end though, Rickroll was too clear a choice to pass up, as it plays perfectly into Rotary Slug Thrower. With just a 2-card drop, you can potentially have a base break. It helps make that just more consistent. Science Fiction Double Feature next. With just a 4-power and a 2-power minion slot available, that leaves Mole, Clyde 2.0, Furious George, and Spy. With no play on minion action so far, that means the minion is definitely coming from Super Spies. Spy is quite weak. While the effect is nice in a critical mass, just having this as an outlier is way below the curve and it doesn't really synergise well with the rest of the faction. I do quite like Mole. While the actual All-Stars excel at extra plays and card draw, they have no specials, and I do quite like the idea of this faction having that as a strength. I do already have a few actions that go well with this effect. I mentioned before that Out of Sight synergises with future cards in the faction, and this is certainly one of them. For the action, while Cyborg Apes have a number of good general choices, I mentioned earlier that I did want an easy action that provided some additional card draw. I'm not talking to the same degree as the actual All-Stars here, but I think all factions appreciate and would benefit from at least one reliable card draw card. So Missing Uplink is in. With those 2 additions, that just leaves 1 power 2 minion slot to come from the core set. For the final actions, I'll return to Pretty Pretty and the Princesses action. Now that I have a movement and special sub-theme, Princesses have the perfect candidate for a special thematic slot in Someday My Prince Will Come, a flexible special that can be used on yourself or your opponent. Watch out for Flock here though. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to include a protection card, and I settled on Secret Base from Superheroes. And I know that Jim from Crank It Up often mentions that base modifiers are some of the easiest actions to play, and I think it's important to have some cards in like Secret Base and Missing Uplink that are easy and very solid cards to play from the very first turn of the game. Finally, before finishing with the core set, there's just What Were We Thinking, the Explorers action. As a movement faction, the Explorers had several viable candidates for this spot, Some choices had already been ruled out by more necessary picks from earlier factions, such as Someday My Prince Will Come, ruling out Euclid's archaeology. In the end, as I have a power sub-theme in the faction, and I personally think that power increases pair very well with movement, I decided to settle on the very flexible I Said No Camels, which could provide extra card draw or extra push when required. And with those additions, that finally brings us to the core set. I had originally thought that the core set would be the easiest to fill the remaining slots, given that there are more factions available, and that is true. However, lots of choices also makes the decisions harder. And I wonder what would have happened if I actually started with the core set instead of ending with it. Anyway, let's start with a Power 2 Minion, as we're confined to a few choices here. The available candidates are Collector, First Mate, Zapbot, Gremlin, Neophyte, and Walker. First Mate would just be too good in this faction, so that's out. Gremlin has no self-synergy, and the faction isn't really about extra plays, so Neophyte is also out. Walker doesn't really make sense, so that's gone. Collector does have some minor synergy with the Power 3 minions in the faction, as well as making Out of Sight not quite so standalone. Zapbot is just solid, but it does feel a little bit out of place. I deliberately toned down the extra plays in the faction, so for me it was Collector, although I did originally have Zapbot earmarked for inclusion. Onto the action now, and with tricksters, pirates, zombies, wizards, and robots to choose from, there was a lot of good choices here. We'll start with the easy one, which is robots, as they only have the tech center, so that's gone. Apart from Disenchant, I don't really like any of the choices here for tricksters. Maybe Enshrouding Mist, but I don't really want another play and base action, and this ability just might be too strong. Pirates basically offer movement and destruction. I made the conscious choice not to have any destruction in the faction, and I don't really need any more movement cards, so these are an easy out as well. I didn't want any more draw cards in the faction, and I didn't want any more extra action plays, as that is the identity of the actual All-Stars. With new Acolytes, I also didn't want any recovery cards, so that's another thing the actual All-Stars aren't actually too bad at. I basically boiled it down to They Keep Coming, Summon, and Outbreak. Summon will pair well with Mole, but it may be too good. They Keep Coming has an anti-synergy with new Acolytes, and I didn't want such a direct recovery card, especially one as good as that. I did quite like Outbreak though. It fit the movement theme quite well, giving you the extra play to spread out and then converge with one of the movement cards in the faction. Ultimately, there were quite a few viable choices. I settled with Outbreak as I felt it would fit nicely, but I could have picked one of about half a dozen different actions here, and I think any of them would have been fine. So with Outbreak in the faction, we're now complete. To take it from the top, we have Leader 2, which fills a similar space to the King Rex. It acts as a big drop, but it can also support the movement available in the faction by helping you move additional power to your target base. For the forwards, Cyclone is just a solid movement card, helping you stay off your chosen target base until you're ready to converge, and again pairing well with Leader 2. Mole gives the faction something very different, something the actual All-Stars lack, which is a special play. The faction packs some really good actions that could change the outcome of a base or allow you to get a head start on another base. The threes are a little bit trickier. Rickroll is another movement card that facilitates the spread and converge strategy the faction's looking for. Bear Cavalry brings some antagonistic movement to the faction and can be used to force an opponent to overcommit on a base, remove a problematic minion, or help give you a little bit of an extra push when you need to break a base. Finally, Muffin is a situational one that can give you a 6 power swing over an opponent on a base. When potentially used with Cyclone and Flock, you can maybe get a sizable burst and swing from no or minimal presence at the start of your turn. Finally, for the twos, Researcher always gives you an action play when you need one, and no consequences draw 2 cards in a pinch. Fledgling Vampire should always be a power 3 minion. Collector can help you slow down your opponent, which is so crucial in a faction with limited extra minion plays. And Flock is a great thematic card in the faction, effectively acting as a Cyclone Shadow. If you can get a power counter onto each of them through I Said No Camels, then with Leader 2 you've got a mobile 10 power you can move wherever you want to. For the actions, I have the main movement theme. You Shall Pass and Headlong are just really solid movement cards, both giving you a nice little benefit for doing so. Someday My Prince Will Come is the second special in the faction and giving you an incredibly flexible card that can be used to potentially solo a base, reduce some of your commitment from a base, or change the final placement positions for a VP swing. Then there are the movement payoff cards. Rotary Slug Thrower is the big finisher, the 1-2 punch when combined with Rickroll. I Said No Camels is a very flexible action that can act as a second finisher to Rotary Slug Thrower, or as a hand refresh after you've done a converge strategy. Outbreak helps you to set up the spread out and converge strategy slightly faster. Finally, for what's left, Secret Base and Missing Uplink are just very easy cards to play, providing an ongoing benefit and giving the faction some nice extra tools in their locker. Missing Uplink is especially nice on a sticky minion like Cyclone. Out of Sight is potentially a very good target for Mole, but otherwise it can again just slow your opponents down, and there are a few good reusable on-play abilities in the faction. And New Acolytes is just a miscellaneous ability, it doesn't really have any synergy, but it can be a powerful effect for yourself or against your opponents. And that's my faction. As I mentioned, this was a lot harder to do than I thought it would be. I can definitely see why some of the factions were left out with the actual All-Stars, however I think I've ended up with a balanced and reasonably well-rounded movement faction. Ironically, looking at the two factions, I actually think the All-Stars would be a good pairing for the alternative All-Stars. You get draw, extra play, special, controlling effects, it's almost a complete package. So what did you think of my alternative All-Stars? How would you make a balanced faction with the cards that were available? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.